As you can see, we're starting a new era, 1750. Why 1750? Well, it has to do with the age of revolutions. And chapter 16 starts off talking about several of these. So let's jump right to it. We're going to start, of course, in the United States. You can see this is a map of the United States after the Revolution. There's, of course, a picture of GW and many of the American troops being led. It was a very difficult revolution. Now, before we start, let's just talk about the age of revolution in general. It was a world crisis. You had revolutions going on in all parts of the world. We talked about the Wahhabist revolution in what today is Saudi Arabia against the Ottoman Empire. Later against the Ottoman Empire would come a Greek revolution. The Safavids would collapse in a revolution. There were revolutions in the Mughals, the Chinese Qing dynasty, the Taiping Revolution. So you could say perhaps that the Atlantic revolutions were part of a rising tide of the revolutionary era. But the uniqueness of the Atlantic revolutions was really that they were based upon Enlightenment principles, the idea of liberty, the idea of self-rule, and inalienable rights. So the other part about that is it spread off each other through pamphlets and printing presses and even newspapers, periodicals. You could say one fed the other. So the Atlantic truly was a world of ideas. Didn't matter if you were French and you knew your French philosophers like Rousseau and Montesquieu. You also knew Locke and Hobbes. And later on, you would know Jefferson and Franklin. So many of these ideas traveled across the Atlantic Ocean. So you could say that it was kind of a beginning of the democratic revolutionary phase. The idea that there is no divine right of monarchs, that people should have some input in their government. And for this, it would spread. The American Revolution would serve as a model for Latin American revolutions. And the French Revolution would spread throughout the rest of Europe as well. So let's start with North America. Was it revolutionary? Well, I don't know. I mean, in a sense that we would gain their independence from a mother kingdom, yes, it was. In a sense that, we were talking Enlightenment ideas or individual government. In a way, we were just growing out of England. I mean, England had been moving in that direction with the strength of Parliament. So what we did, and I mean our ancestors who came to these shores and established the United States, is that we kind of modeled our institutions of government after England, sans a king, well, he wasn't an absolutist, but a constitutional monarch. So what we really began to see in the colonial times is that the English in England began they always acted a little bit superior than the English in America. We talk about Creoles and the Creole class, the native-born class. They're the ones that are going to inspire revolutions. But at first they thought they were good Englishmen. For instance, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. They wanted to be good Englishmen. But they found out they were never going to be truly accepted as equal Englishmen. So the English kind of looked down their noses on what they referred to as our American cousins. And they didn't treat them equally. And that irked a lot of the people in the colonies. And so during the French and Indian War, which was really a global war, it was really the 7 Years' War that spanned across the Americas, Europe, and even Asia, we helped out the British, of course. Mainly the British would say they helped out us because they protected us from attacks by the French and Indians. So when the war was over, England found itself in debt, and they figured that they should get much of that money from new taxes on the American colonies, that we should chip in. But we felt like since we were not represented in Parliament, this was taxation without representation, and that we should be accorded a seat in Parliament, or at least some say-so in both our political and economic affairs. So you could say that, the idea that the United Colonies at that time were revolutionary prior to the revolution. Well, many of these colonies had ideas of self-rule, especially as they expanded westward. For instance, from Philadelphia into western Pennsylvania, or from Tidewater, Virginia, into the more mountainous Shenandoah region. Those people had to be more self-sufficient, and they didn't need the rule of government as much, a distant government that they felt like didn't really understand their needs. And so, you could say that they had developed their own institutions of self-rule that were not as reliant on Great Britain. The picture you see at the bottom is the Boston Massacre, which you should know a little bit about, which is pretty famous because, well, of course, the British troops fired on these drunken, rioting Boston colonists, but also one of the famous deaths was a freed black man known as Crispus Attucks. That's a picture of Lady Liberty. That's the French Revolution. Let me just go back and finish up the American Revolution. So, when the United States was created and we broke away, as I mentioned, we served as a model of how colonies can break away from other countries. But we also served as a model of self-rule and individual rights. In fact, we took it too far with the Articles of Confederation, which proved unwieldy, and we had to create a more federalist government with our Constitution in 1789. But truly, the idea of a democracy, that's what was revolutionary. So what about the French? We know we couldn't have gained our independence without the French. Because their enemy was Britain, they would finance us, not just with weapons and money, but they also sent an army under Rochambeau and a fleet under de Grasse that helped bottle up the British at the Battle of Yorktown, which was the final battle of the American Revolution. But France was still under what was known as the Old Regime, which was an absolute monarch with three estates, three classes, the clergy, the nobles, and then 98% of the people was the third estate, which was everybody else. And so the first two estates had all privileges. They didn't even really have to pay much taxes, though they had all the wealth and power. And the king lived a luxurious lifestyle. His name was Louis XVI. He wasn't very popular. He was kind of a weak leader. And he had a very unpopular queen whose name was Marie Antoinette. She was actually Austrian, and the French hated the Austrians, but it was an arranged marriage. She came over at about, 15 years old to marry Louis, never meeting him, not speaking a word of French. She didn't really know how to act as queen, so she thought she should act very beautifully decorated with gowns and throw lavish parties and wear rich, expensive jewelry, so much so that the people called her Madame Deficit, meaning she spent so much money. And at first she couldn't perform the duty of the queen, meaning she didn't have an heir. That was really actually Louis's fault, but once they got that issue fixed, they ended up having several children. But still, she remained unpopular, and he remained weak. And France was bankrupt. Financing the American Revolution cost them a lot of money. Plus, as I mentioned, they spent a lot of money. And then, to compound this, they had back-to-back bad harvests. This really left the people of France without their beloved bread. And the price of bread skyrocketed. It's always said that revolution occurs when people are hungry. I'm not going to take up arms against my government if my children are well fed. But if I see them starving, that's going to lead me to take more drastic measures. So, back-to-back bad harvests, bad taxation system, incredible deficit spending, all this led to King Louis calling a meeting of the Estates General. And the idea was the Estates General hadn't met for hundreds of years, really, but they were the three estates. And Louis's plan was, should I tax the first two estates? Well, they voted. And the first estate voted no, and the second estate voted no, but the third estate voted yes. And Louis was like, darn, that's too bad. It didn't pass. And the third estate was like, What do you mean it didn't pass? 98% of the people want it. And he's like, well, that's not the way the estate general works. It's 2 against 1. Well, the third estate really began agitating to create a national assembly. The idea that they should have a permanent parliament, kind of like British Parliament, because this isn't going to work. Well, Louis panicked and locked him out, and the third estate went across the street and took what was called the tennis court oath, which basically said, we're not leaving here until the king grants us a national assembly. Well, eventually the people began rioting. The picture in the bottom right is the storming of the Bastille, which occurred on July 14th, which is considered the beginning of the French Revolution. The king eventually granted them a national assembly where they would pass the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which really kind of created a new concept of equality before the law, meaning the law should treat people the same no matter what, if they were rich or poor. The punishment for the crime should be the same. So women were truly at the forefront of the revolution. You could find them leading many of the more radical groups, especially the group that marched to Versailles and slaughtered the king's guards and forced Louis and Marie Antoinette to return to Paris. But despite the fact that women participated in the revolution and often led it and demanded equality of rights, in fact, many women leaders said, we are the third estate of the third estate, meaning they're the lowest of the low. In the end, you could say that politically, patriarchy reigned supreme. Even the radical men looked at women and still decided that their place was more in the home and they shouldn't be meddling in politics. But women did greatly support the revolution. And what you began to see, especially as France's neighbors, specifically Austria and Prussia, declared war on France, it became more radical. And now the concept was more the birth of the nation. All people should serve the nation, regardless of estates. And what happened was the revolution turned into the hands of the Jacobins, who were the radical group led by Maximilien Robespierre. And they put Louis on trial. Louis had tried to escape, and that made him look bad. He tried to sneak out of the country with his family. And so Louis was executed by the guillotine, and later Marie Antoinette was executed. And so were many, many members of the first two estates, marquises, cardinals, bishops. And so the revolution kind of became very, very radical during the Reign of Terror. And despite this, some good reforms were passed. For instance, the metric system and new law codes. Robespierre tried to eliminate the Catholic Church, which kind of was their undoing because it had a lot of support in the countryside. But he turned the Cathedral of Notre Dame into the cult of the Supreme Being. And what happened was Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety began to execute anybody they thought was a threat. You had to call everybody citizen. You couldn't call them madame and monsieur, or they would say you had monarchist tendencies, and they would lop off your head. So in the end, the Committee of Public Safety turned on Robespierre, and pretty much the last head to roll was Robespierre. He was executed on the guillotine, but they had him turned face up so he could see the blade come down on him. After that, they didn't want one man to have power, so they formed a 5-headed monster called the Directory. And this Directory was kind of weak, and it would eventually be overthrown in what is known as a coup d'etat, stroke of state, or a military overthrow of the government, by none other than Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a French Revolution. Alright, so here you see a picture of the guillotine and all the various devils. This was kind of the rest of Europe's depiction of the French Revolution, that the revolution unleashed, hell on earth, and that's something to be avoided. And we'll make that the end of part 1.